Welcome to the Sagebrush Trail, stories of the West, from the frontier to the Yukon. I'm Mardell, reading Crossing the Plains, Days of 57 by William Audley Maxwell. Chapter 7, Tangled by a Tornado. Few readers need peruse these pages to learn what a thunderstorm is like, but many may not know what it is to encounter a fierce electrical disturbance while surrounded by a herd of uncontrollable cattle on the prairie. On an occasion, after having stopped for a nooning, there loomed up suddenly in the northwest a black, ominous cloud, revolving swiftly and threateningly, as might the vapors from some gigantic cauldron, variegated in black, blue, and green, bespangled with red streaks of lightning. This display of the angry elements was making a broadening sweep onward directly towards where we were. The air turned black and murky and was vibrant with electric tension. Flocks of buzzards flew low to the earth above us, as if to be ready for the carrion of the impending catastrophe. The fear instinct of the brute seized the cattle, and they hovered together, bellowing, distraught with apprehension of evil. The whirlpool of atmospheric chaos grew more intense and rapidly larger as it approached. Globules of water began to spat on the ground here and there, as the storm cloud opened its batteries of liquid balls. There was only such protection as the wagons afforded. Whatever preparation we could make must be effected at once. Knowing that if the cattle should take fright and run, it would be better that they leave the wagons, I dropped the wagon tongue to which I was hitching a team, and called to a boy who was hooking up the next wagon, telling him not to do so. He had, however, already attached to that wagon the team consisting of 3 yoke of oxen. The big drops of water were in a moment followed by hailstones, at first very large and scattering, striking the ground each with a vicious thud, a subdued whack, growing more frequent, and presently mingled with lesser ones, until in the shortest moment there was a cloudburst of hail and rain pouring upon us, a storm such as none of us had ever witnessed. The oxen, chained together in strings of 3 and 4 pairs, pelted by the hail, were mutinous and altogether uncontrollable. My own string, having turned crosswise of the front end of the wagon, were pushing it backward down the hillside. The team, in charge of the boy, being attached to their wagon and heading away from the storm, were turning the wagon over. Knowing that the boy's mother was in the schooner on a sick bed, I left my wagon and ran to that. As the oxen, in trying to shield themselves from the hail, were forcing the front wheels around under the wagon box, I was fortunate enough to get a shoulder under one corner of the box and exert sufficient force to prevent the wagon upsetting. All this took little more than a minute. The storm passed away as suddenly as it had come. Then I saw the wagon, which was my special charge, lying on its side at the bottom of the slope, the bows of the cover fitting snugly in a sort of natural gutter, with a swift current of muddy water and hailstones flowing through the cover as if it were a sluice pipe. Everything in the wagon was topsy-turvy, and half buried in the heap were 2 little girls who had been riding in the vehicle. They were more frightened than hurt, but complained loudly at being placed in a cold storage of hailstones. Meantime, the sun beamed again, clear and hot, and we saw the storm cloud pursuing its course over the plains to the southeast, leaving in its wake a wet path a few rods wide. The other men had their hands full in caring for endangered members of the party and the equipment. The loose stock had stampeded and were far away, with some of the mounted men in desperate pursuit. They eventually brought the cattle to a halt, about 5 miles away, where the wagons overtook them when it was time to make camp. Continuous travel over rough ground and through deep sand and ascending steep mountains proved too great a strain for the endurance of some outfits. From time to time, we were obliged to witness instances of extreme privation and hardship, usually the result of inadequate preparation for the arduous journey. Some started with only enough oxen to carry them in case all should remain serviceable, and carried provisions for no more than the shortest limit of time estimated, so that the mishap of losing an ox or two, or any delay, worked a calamity. Some trains started so late, or were so much delayed, that they were compelled to negotiate passage of the higher mountains after the time when enormous snowdrifts had to be encountered, further delay resulting with exhaustion of strength and depletion of supplies, in consequence of which many members of some trains failed to reach their destination. A notable experience of this kind was that of the Donner Party in 1846. It was in one of the higher mountain regions that we overtook one Eben Darby and his family. Darby had been with one of the trains in advance of us, but being unable to keep the pace, he was obliged to fall behind. He had one small wagon, 2 yoke of oxen, and a cow, the latter led by a rope behind the wagon. His wife, with a young baby, and the wife's brother, Danny Worley, were the only persons with Darby. The wife was a weak, inexperienced girl, the child sickly. Mrs. Darby's brother was a large, fat youth of 19, whose distinguishing and inconvenient characteristic was an abnormal appetite. Their provisions were nearly exhausted. The cow was to them the real fountain of life. She was doing nobly, supplying them with a quart of milk a day, which was wonderful considering the circumstances. This milk fed the baby and afforded a good substitute for butter in the form of milk gravy, on which Danny fared sumptuously every day. Later, their oxen drank of the alkali water of the Humboldt River, and 3 of the 4 died in one night. Then the cow was yoked with the remaining ox. 2 steers were loaned them by good Samaritans in our company, and they were with us to the sink of the Humboldt. Meantime, the milk supply grew less, and Mrs. Darby was compelled to substitute water for milk in the gravy. This sop was not satisfactory to Danny. One evening at mealtime, he was overheard by some of our boys saying, "I want milk in my gravy." Though reminded there was only enough milk for the baby, he of the phenomenal appetite reiterated, "I don't care, I want milk in my gravy." Thereafter, Gravy was the name by which he was known so long as he traveled with us. This narrative would not do justice to the variety of individuals and events without mention of another singular personage, a young fellow who was working his passage, a sort of disconnected unit whose place became everywhere in the train and who belonged to nobody. How he got smuggled into the company, no one has since been able to recall. He was a sort of desert stowaway, tolerated because, though eccentric and quite alarming in appearance, he was always in good humor and often useful, having a willingness to do as many of the chores as others would trust him to perform. He was notable as a physical curiosity, though not actually deformed. Low of stature, he came to be known as Shorty, the only name we ever had for him. As he stood, his abnormally long arms enabled him to take his hat from the ground without stooping. His legs were not mates in length, causing him, as he moved with a quick, rocking gait, to create the impression that he might topple backward, but somehow the longer leg always got underneath at the critical instant and restored the balance. His head was large and perfectly round, hair porcupine-esque, each bristle standing nearly perpendicular to the plane on which it grew. He had no neck, mouth small and so round that it opened not unlike a bored hole in a flesh-colored pumpkin. Shorty asserted that he was a singer. He and Jack never sang together, however, that is, they never did so any more after trying it once. Shorty and Gravy Worley became chums inseparable, except on one occasion, when their friendship was temporarily ruptured by a dispute over the ownership of a fishing hook. Anger grew hot, but when they were about to come to blows, Shorty suddenly dropped on all fours and essayed to butt his adversary with his head, which surprising mode of combat so disconcerted Gravy that he ran for his quarters, wildly yelling, "Take him off! Take him off!" For a time during the early part of the journey, the horses and mules were picketed at night on the best pasture available, and before we retired, all the animals were brought near the wagons, the loose cattle bunched with them, and guards were placed to prevent straying of the stock or surprise by Indians. Later, for a while, these precautions were deemed unnecessary, though still later they had to be resumed. The stock became accustomed to the daily routine, and after the all-day travel were quite willing, when they had finished their evening grazing, to assemble near the camp and lie down for the night, usually remaining comparatively quiet till morning, as if having some realization of the lonely nature of the surroundings. The animals were not disposed to stray off except on rare occasions, but rather to keep within sight of the people and the wagons. There was proof of the theory that in some circumstances domestic animals acquire some of that feeling that human creatures know when far from the habitations of man. There is a peculiar sensation in the great and boundless contiguity of empty silence which works the senses up to a feeling that is somewhat alike in man and beast, that there is most comfort and protection near the center of the settlement or camp, in the stillness of the night, and night on these plains was often very still. Any slight noise outside the camp startled and thrilled the taut nerves. Not only was the night still, usually it was silent too. But occasionally, when the silence was absolute, a couple or more of prairie wolves lurking in the vicinity, without the faintest note of prelude, would startle the calm of night with their peculiar commingling of barks, howls, and wails, a racket all their own. It was the habit of these night prowlers of the desert to come as near to the camp as their acute sense of safety permitted, and there, sitting on their haunches, their noses pointed to the moon, render a serenade that was truly thrilling. Two prairie wolves in a fugue duet can emit more disquieting noise, with a less proportion of harmony, than any aggregation of several times their equal in numbers, not excepting Indians on the warpath or a gutter band. That awe of the wilderness, to which reference has been made, and its effect on the nerves, may explain the stampede of cattle, often not otherwise accounted for, which occurs sometimes in these hollow solitudes. It occurs nowhere else that I have known. Several times we experienced the strange exhibition of sudden panic, the snapping, as it were, of the nerves from undue tension, when instantly, from cause then to us unknown and unguessed, the whole band of cattle, teams as well as loose stock, made a sudden, wild, furious dash in a compact mass, seeming instinctively to follow in whatever direction the leader's impulse led him, drifting together and forward as naturally as water flows to the current, with heads and tails high in the air, blindly trampling to the earth whatever chanced to be in their path. These were not in any sense wild stock. The cattle, horses, and mules were all animals that had been raised on the quiet farms of the Middle West, well domesticated. In the light of certain modern theories, it might be said by some that these otherwise docile animals stampeded on the unpeopled plains because they heard the call of the wild. There were, however, occasions when the cause could be readily assigned for this temporary casting off of restraint. In one instance already mentioned, a sudden pelting hailstorm was the undoubted cause, When taking the stampede temper, they ran 5 or 6 miles before the man, mounted on one of our fleetest saddle horses, got in front of the foremost of them and checked their running. On all such occasions, control could be regained in only one way: speeding his horse till he overtook and passed the leader of the drove. The rider made his horse the leader, and as each loose animal always followed whatever was in front, the horseman, by making a circuit and gradually slackening the pace, led the drove around and back to the place in the line of travel. Naturally, one source of uneasiness was the thought of what our situation would be if on one of these occasions we should fail to regain control of these animals, so necessary to us in continuing the westward journey. A stampede when some of the oxen were yoked to the wagons was, of course, more serious in its immediate consequences than when it happened while all were detached from the equipment. A stampede occurred one day in a level stretch of country, open in every direction, nothing in sight to cause alarm. There the emigrant road showed plainly before us. The wagons were in open single file, the loose stock drawn out in line at the rear. Men on horseback, hats over their eyes, some of them with one leg curled over the pommel of the saddle, lazily droning away the slow hours and the humdrum miles. The women and children were stowed away on bundles of baggage and camp stuff in the wagons, some of them asleep perhaps, rocked in their schooner cradles. A few of the men and boys perchance were strolling off the way in the hope of starting a sage-grouse or rabbit from some sheltering clump of brush. During a specially quiet routine like this, the cattle lolling behind the wagons, mostly unattended, keeping the snail pace set by the patient teams, a steer now and again turning aside to appropriate a tuft of bunch grass, their white horns rising and falling in the brilliant sunlight, with the swaying motion of their bodies as they walked, shimmered like waves of a lake at noonday before a gentle breeze. Quickly as a clap of hands, every loose beast in the band, in the wildest fashion of terror, started straight in the course of the moving line. Pell-mell they went, fearing for nothing that they could run over, sweeping on with a roaring tramp. Like muffled thunder they passed along both sides of the train. The teams, catching the frenzy, took up the race as best they could with their heavy impediments, all beyond control of their drivers or the herders, who, startled from the reverie of the moment, could do no better than dodge to such place of safety as they found, and stand aghast at the spectacle. Fortunately, the draft oxen usually were forced to stop running before they went far, owing to the weight of the wagons they hauled and their inability to break the yokes. In this particular instance, the most serious casualty was the death of a boy about 8 years of age, the son of Dr. Kidd. The child was probably asleep in a wagon, and being aroused by the unusual commotion may have attempted to look out, when a jolt of the wagon threw him to the ground, and he was trampled to death. The body was kept in camp overnight, and the next morning wrapped in a sheet and buried by the roadside. This was in a vast stretch of lonely plain. As we journeyed through it, viewing the trackless hills and rock-ribbed mountains not far away on either side, mostly barren and uninviting, it was difficult to conceive of that territory ever becoming the permanent homes of men. Yet it is possible and probable that the grave of Dr. Kidd's little boy is today within the limits of a populous community, or even beneath the noisy thoroughfare of some busy town. Join me next time for more Western adventure in Crossing the Plains Days of 57 by William Audley Maxwell, here on the Sagebrush Trail.